goes under here, don't we? Because undoubtedly, this is the lair of the deluded Baron Frankenstein. And under here, a ghastly collection of human remains, stolen from charnel houses and colleges of medical science. During the height of the storm, Frankenstein will operate a lever and let electric power from the heavens pour through the reconstructed corpse. Life will course through the limbs. The body will move and rise from the table. And Frankenstein and his monster will begin their doom-laden adventures once again. That's the mental image of the Frankenstein story nearly all of us have carried ever since, in 1931, Universal Pictures made their classic Frankenstein movie starring Boris Karloff as the monster. And by now, over 30 Frankenstein films have been made in England and America alone. What's the truth behind the creation of the story? Let's forget the monstrous tale as told by Hollywood. How and when was the first account set down? Where did the idea of an artificially created human being come from? And who was the first Frankenstein? The search for Frankenstein begins on Lake Geneva in Switzerland in 1816, the year after the Battle of Waterloo. A strange group of English exiles decided to spend the summer over there at Colony. Among them, Mary Shelley, soon to become famous as the author of Frankenstein, the New Prometheus, and the two famous poets, Percy Bysshe Shelley and Lord Byron. Byron rented a splendid house, the Villa Diodati. It's still much the same outside as when the English milord and his personal physician, Dr. John Polidori, lounged on the balcony 170 years ago. 100 yards down the hill from Byron's money-eating palace, the Shelleys lived more humbly in a small farmhouse called Montalegre, which no longer exists. Playing gooseberry to Shelley and Mary's toothsome at Montalegre was Claire Claremont, a literary groupie with a considerable amount of push, but not much judgment. According to all standards, they were an odd bunch and left a deep impression on the local people. Let's go over their sexual entanglements, which make Dynasty look like a morality play. Shelley was already married, but to someone else. He'd run off with our heroine, whose maiden name was Mary Godwin. Now, follow this closely or you'll lose track. Claire Claremont was the daughter of Mary's father's second wife, and therefore Mary's stepsister. Claire's chief purpose in Switzerland was to be Lord Byron's mistress and bear his daughter Allegra. Byron had gone one better than Shelley by committing incest with his own sister. Dr. John Polidori, the physician, was the only person not built into this group of upper-class hippies. Mary herself was the daughter of two unusual parents. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, who died giving birth to Mary, was a very early woman's liber. Her father, William Godwin, was a left-wing philosopher, a sort of English Voltaire.
At this time, Mary was only 18 years old. With a collection of people like that, something was always likely to happen. It was a wet and miserable summer, and the group were cooped up in Villa Diodati for days on end. The crucial moment came when Lord Byron issued a general challenge.
Lord Byron said, "We will each write a ghost story," and his proposition was acceded to. He began a tale, a fragment of which he printed at the end of his poem of Mazeppa. Shelley commenced one founded on the experiences of his early life. Poor Polidori had some terrible idea about a skull-headed lady. I busied myself to think of a story which would make the reader dread to look round, curdle the blood and quicken the beatings of the heart. Night waned upon this talk, and even the witching hour had gone by before we retired to rest.
This green square is all that now marks the position of the Shelleys' house. As near as I can work out, it was on this exact spot that Mary started writing Frankenstein. A look at the plot of the novel itself shows how she based it on her own experiences in Switzerland. Mary makes Victor Frankenstein a citizen of Geneva itself, though he creates the monster while at university in Germany. When Frankenstein and the rest of humanity reject the monster because of its horrific appearance, it decides to take vengeance on its creator and follows him home to Geneva. In this area of Plain Palais, which in those days was an open space outside the town walls, the monster finds Victor's little brother William and murders him. Seeking revenge, Victor pursues his creation to the Mer de Glace, a glacier overlooking the village of Chamonix, 60 miles from Geneva. Here, the monster persuades Victor that if he is given a companion, a female, a mate, he'll trouble Victor no more. The terrific description of the glacier is based on a visit that Mary and Shelley made up here in that summer in 1816. But in the book, Victor goes back on his promise. The monster then murders Victor's best friend. Finally, at Evian, back on the shores of Lake Geneva, he kills Frankenstein's recently married bride. The story ends, still in icy surroundings, with Frankenstein hunting the creature through the northern ocean. There, Victor dies of sickness and grief, and the monster disappears forever.
If all this is based on personal experience, and in the first novel, ideas often are, it is fair to ask, where did Mary get the idea for the monster from?
She ran off with Shelley when she was 16, and Shelley himself was incredibly keen on science, had always experimented from when he was first walking. He was setting fire boats off across Horsham Ponds in Sussex and blowing up old trees with gunpowder. So science was very much her youthful background. It was also a most exciting time for them to be young, and there was enormous revolutions going on in philosophy and science and politics, of course, with the French Revolution that had just come and gone and shaken institutions that they thought were immutable. Shelley and Byron and Dr. Polidori and Claire Clairmont used to meet in the evenings and sit by the fire with the candles lit and the electric storms going out over the lake, and they would discuss these latest experiments. and they would speculate about ghosts, about galvanism, about mesmerism, about electricity, about whether the vital spark could be imparted to inanimate objects. And this was an extraordinarily exciting sort of undergraduate discussions going on. And I think that was probably the immediate impulse for her novel.
Well, that's a lot of the explanation, but not all of it in my view. A view I formed after months of exploring the arcane history of science at the time of Mary and her father. There were practical experiments on transplants, robotics, and healing with electricity, almost forgotten today, but widely talked about at the time. Mary, we know, was interested in electrical experiments through a link with Shelley. And some of the experimenters were part of her childhood background, known to her father because they were also famous for their new ideas in politics. Among them was Jean-Paul Marat, the French revolutionary who was stabbed to death in his bath by Charlotte Corday. Marat, who was a doctor in private life, published a book on the medical uses of electricity. Another freethinker, Benjamin Franklin, a leader of the American War of Independence, had his electrical treatments christened Franklinism in his honor.
Would you believe it or not, but in 1774, it was a Royal Society, they called it a Royal Humane Society, established here in London in order to resuscitate, revive people apparently dead. And they have in their archives quite a reputable list of cases where really they succeeded. Now I'm going to wire you with some bits and pieces. This one is a ground electrode. And here is the pickup electrode.
The effects of electrical stimulation on the body are as striking today as they were 200 years ago.
Now tell me, please, when you start to feel the...
Here the nerves in my arm are being affected by electrical impulses at regular intervals, causing movements I can't control.
You see?
Yes.
And as it moves...
This is similar to the classical experiment of Professor Galvani of Bologna in making a frog's leg twitch, except that Galvani affected the frog's muscle rather than its nerves. The frog was dead. But in the 18th century, the suggestion to the well-informed was that, given the right kind of electrical impulses, even a dead body might come back to life. The experiment was tried in London by Galvani's nephew, Dr. Aldini. At Tyburn in 1803, a murderer called Forster was executed. Aldini had his body taken to the College of Surgeons, where he gave it shocks from a battery. One touch from the electrodes caused a strong movement in the leg. Another contact made the body's eye open. Aldini himself commented that such violent movements occurred as almost to give the reappearance of life. Forster, of course, was quite beyond recall, but the tests certainly gave the impression to imaginative minds that electricity might restore life to a corpse. That's not all. The business of actually building the monster is only hinted at in the book, but it is clearly made of bits and pieces taken from different bodies. And there really was a transplant operation which was well known in Mary's time. Not on the scale of modern heart and lung work, but nonetheless highly suggestive. The implantation of human teeth. Here it is in progress in a cartoon of the time by Thomas Rowlandson. The dentist is yanking a healthy tooth out of a chimney sweep's jaw, ready to push it into the gums of a rich lady waiting next to him. She's already had her diseased tooth pulled, hence the need for smelling salts. No anesthetic then, remember? Given luck, a transplant would actually take and could last up to 5 years. A front tooth might fetch 2 or 3 guineas, equal to £100 today. So as Frankenstein did with the monster, parts could be successfully moved from one body to another. A girl called Emma Hart is said to have decided to sell her front teeth because she was out of work and penniless. But on her way to the dentist, she ran into a fellow servant who suggested that a pretty girl had an easier way of making money. Emma accepted the advice and went on to become Lord Nelson's mistress, Lady Hamilton, instead of selling her teeth to the doctors. Dr. John Hunter, the famous surgeon, was responsible for making tooth transplants popular. It was also Hunter who devised another kind of creation of human life, using artificial insemination, again in the late 18th century. Dealing with a case of a husband and a wife who couldn't produce a child, he advised the husband to collect his fresh seminal emissions in a syringe and inject them immediately into his wife. This operation was a success, and the lady conceived. Another now forgotten triumph of medical science, which showed that not only God but man might take part in the creation of life. And apart from medical experiments, this early type of robot could have given another stimulus to Mary's teenage imagination.
That painful piece of organ playing comes from what is probably the most striking example of artificial life available to Mary Shelley. This automaton is one of 3 in the Museum of Art and History in Neuchâtel, about 2 hours' drive from Geneva. Now, this lady really plays. I'll show you. Lift her off. Her fingers still go like that, but to port her teeth, the little organ has to be struck properly to make it play. So there she goes back again.
A second figure can be programmed to write messages. And a third draws a skillful selection of pictures. These figures were all made by the Jacques Droz Company, brilliant mechanics who lived and worked in the Neuchâtel area, a center of Swiss watchmaking. The machinery which controls each movement still works as well as the day this model was built, over 200 years ago. Many figures like this were made in the area, and it's likely that Mary knew of them. She and Shelley certainly visited Neuchâtel during an earlier continental holiday in 1814, and the Frankenstein figures toured Europe. Jacques Droz himself had offices not only in Neuchâtel, but in Geneva and London, all familiar to Mary.
When Mary first sat down to write, the knowledge of these discoveries and objects was still fresh in her mind. Add to that another vital spark, that of creative ability, and you'll begin to understand how the monster came into being.
And now, what about that poor lost soul, Frankenstein? Who was he based on? Well, partly on Shelley himself.
Above all, Frankenstein, the novel, is a work of tremendous imagination. I think it's an absolute triumph, and it is quite exceptional novel. And so it's not just a little story of her husband as hero, but nevertheless, Shelley's personality is deeply imbued in the personality of Victor Frankenstein, the scientist who creates this monster. Mary was very aware of the complexity of this man who she adored. He was a very fugitive person, both in his own personality and in his way of life. He was always on the run from something, whether real or imaginary aggressors. Her life with him was spent largely in exile. They were ostracized by society. They were actually looked on as being extremely dangerous for their views and for the way they lived. And there's no doubt that this great novel of pursuit and the pain of being ostracized and shut out from ordinary human society comes very strongly from her life with Shelley and from Shelley himself.
But what about the second half of the character? The part that's not Shelley, but Frankenstein. Where does the name Frankenstein come from? There's a very strong possibility, and working it out takes us on an unexpected journey.
The Shelleys and the ever-present Claire travelled home from Basel down the River Rhine to Rotterdam at the end of their earlier trip to Switzerland. Passenger boats still make the same journey. It's a luxurious trip today, but in 1814 it could be hard work, with the passengers themselves having to pull the boat along by a rope. Mary's journal tells what happened below Mannheim in Germany.
We proceed towards Mainz with an unfavourable wind. Towards evening, the boatman rests, just as the wind changes in our favour. We walk for 3 hours. We are alone.
Claire's journal adds the extra information that the stopping place was called Gernsheim.
Lass ihn hinten ein bisschen draußen, Hans, der Wind ist drauf.
The whole region is riddled with words starting with Franken, because this is Franconia, one of the homes of the ancient Frankish people. And only 10 miles to the east of here, of Gernsheim, lies a castle on a mighty hill, the ancient stronghold of the barons of Frankenstein.
This castle, the Rock of the Franks, was held by the Frankenstein family for 400 years. Claims that Mary visited the castle itself are impossible. She would never have made the round trip and the climb up the hill in the 3 hours available. But she could certainly have collected the Frankenstein family name for further use during her brief stay at Gernsheim.
That's a strong enough connection. But we've discovered an even more remarkable possibility. Between the ages of 14 and 16, Mary spent most of her time living with a family called Baxter in Dundee. William Baxter was an admirer of the thoughts of Mary's father, William Godwin. In Dundee, the city of jute and jam, he was a moderately prosperous merchant in the jute business.
The question is, did the Baxters ever go on a family trip to Darmstadt, the nearest German city to Frankenstein, taking their young friend Mary Godwin with them? Walter Scheele, a journalist and Frankenstein enthusiast, believes they did.
In 1981-82, I had to do a take for Radio of Luxembourg about Frankenstein and the monster shows at Darmstadt. And so I met a man at the Darmstadt court called Peter Baumgartel, who had to do with all the papers they had in the Second World War. And he had cleared up all that facts. And he told in 1812 there had been a young lady of distinction coming from Britain at the Darmstadt court. And she was very interested in that papers. And she was with the initials Mary and then Wollstonecraft Godwin. And she was together with a family from Scotland called, with the initials B, Baxter. And during that time, from 1812 to 14, Mary Shelley had been together with the Baxter family. And in 1813, they had been on a trip through Europe, such a sightseeing trip.
It's not an easy story to check. We've gone through the surviving Baxter papers and talked to the present-day members of the family, but there's simply not enough evidence, one way or the other, about what the Baxters were doing throughout 1813. But there's one fact to support Walter Scheele's story. In her old age, William Baxter's daughter Christie claimed that Mary started writing Frankenstein while she was living in Dundee, and not during the Lake Geneva party 3 years later. The visit to Darmstadt would certainly fit with this suggestion.
Whatever the truth, Frankenstein seems to be the place where the name came from. And the castle is where the growth point for the story is today. Victor Frankenstein's imaginary life was based partly on artistic creation, partly on science, but now he is really taking over.
Yes, about 8 years ago, an American public affairs officer came to me and said, I will have a party with my friends, a Halloween party. I said, yes, no problem. I don't know what's Halloween, but even you have birthday or Halloween, you can have your party here. We sell food and drink, and you have the party. This is normal, we have this a lot of time. But not 400 people was coming. On the first day came 4,000, on the second day 5,000 people, and everybody was really surprised about this success of this Halloween party. And now I think we have the world's biggest Halloween party here on board Frankenstein. We had buses from Spain, from Ireland, and even from the States they came by aeroplane to join this party.
The whole thing is getting slightly out of control. Visitors come dressed as monsters, not only Frankenstein's, but Count Dracula and others. There are horror postcards on sale, and a local schoolteacher is doing a roaring trade in Frankenstein follow-up novels under the pen name of Dan Schocker. But this thriving industry today is linked with tragedy in the past. The Frankenstein connection wasn't so light-hearted for those involved at the time. It was more like the curse of Tutankhamun. Shelley himself was drowned in a boating accident, and his wife killed herself in the Serpentine. Byron caught a fatal fever in Greece, and his daughter Allegra died while still young. Dr. John Polidori poisoned himself with prussic acid. 10 years after Lake Geneva, only Claire Clairmont, whom nobody ever found how to get rid of, and Mary herself were still alive. Plus, of course, Mary's famous story. The Frankenstein novel seems to have developed its own independent life, rather like the monster himself. But in the end, the most curious fact of all is that in the original story writing contest, two of England's finest poets failed totally. They were beaten hands down by a teenage girl.